Considering that without their work, there would be no movies whatsoever, there was a moment in time when screenwriters' place was surprisingly far down the Hollywood food chain. So far down, in fact, that they were often the butt of rude jokes. Like the famous one, did you hear about the Polish starlet? She slept with a writer. Apologies to everyone, especially the fine and intelligent people of Poland. But there were exceptions to this rule. Superstar screenwriters who became nearly household names. There was Dalton Trumbo, Paddy Chayefsky, William Goldman. But no screenwriter became quite as famous or more aggressively rejected that image of the screenwriter as schlub as Joe Eszterhas, who happens to be my guest on this episode of The Originals. I'm your host, Andrew Goldman, and I've interviewed celebrities for decades. And what I learned was most of these people don't actually want to share really much of themselves with me. They're there to sell something, which is understandable. But I created The Originals to talk to people who did want to share. People who are beyond playing that game. These are people with stories to share. Maybe a few of them have some scores to settle. And unbelievable gossip to tell me. And believe me, you absolutely have to stay tuned for the most mind-blowing story you have ever heard about the actor Marlon Brando, I guarantee you. Before setting off for Hollywood, Joe Eszterhas was a journalist. He started at the Cleveland Plain Dealer, and then he went to Rolling Stone. But following the success of 1983's Flashdance, which he co-wrote, and then 1985's Jagged Edge, Eszterhas became famous for what's called the spec script. This is an original screenplay written without a particular studio in mind that he'd just sell to the highest bidder. He made a record $3 million for Basic Instinct, and then $3.7 million for Showgirls, and then $4 million for a 4-page outline of an idea for a film called One Night Stand. An outline! $4 million. You've never heard of One Night Stand? It's because One Night Stand never got made. Eszterhas, however, got to keep the dough. $1 million a page. I mean, do you think about that and you think that's fucking insane?
Absolutely. On any kind of normal level, it's totally insane, but those are the rules of the game at that point. It's like what ball players make today, what basketball players make today, $30 million a season, 25, you know.
Not only did Eszterhas plunder Hollywood like a soldier of fortune, he kind of dressed like one, often wearing a string of 38 shells around his cowboy boot and brandishing a hunting knife.
So I always had a knife to clean my pipe out. We were having an editorial meeting one day, and I forgot what it was, but it was something that pissed me off, and I was cleaning my pipe, Stoddle, and I said, oh, damn it, I slammed the knife into the table.
I visited Eszterhas in Cleveland, where he lives in a big white house in one of those suburban subdivisions of pristine mansions. He grew up dirt poor in Cleveland, the only son of Hungarian emigres. He moved back to Cleveland not long after the debacle that we all know as Showgirls. 6 months after returning to Cleveland, Eszterhas, who was a 4-pack-a-day smoker and a heavy drinker, was diagnosed with throat cancer, and 80% of his larynx was removed, which is why he can't speak much above a whisper. Joe Eszterhas, thank you for doing The Originals.
It's my pleasure.
You know, Ebert, he psychoanalyzed you. He said, quote, a fear of women palpitates in all his best work. They'll kill you, but if you're lucky, they'll have sex with you first and maybe put on a lesbian show.
That's funny.
Are you afraid of women?
I've never, am I afraid of him? Is there any woman that I've been afraid of? Well, yeah, when Naomi loses her temper, she's part Italian. I like women very much, and I always have. I like the company of women actually more than I like the company of men. I like women who are smart and have a great set of balls and who are also pretty, and there are a lot of women like that.
We should probably clarify, when you say a great set of balls, you're not talking about a particular kink, are you?
No. I'm not. Although I don't really blame you for asking the question.
Okay. We begin with Eszterhas's pietà, basic, as he likes to call it.
Let me ask you something, Mr. Mel. Are you sorry he's dead?
Yeah. I liked fucking him.
Now, Basic Instinct had a very happy ending. $350 million in global box office receipts when all was said and done. But its development and production were really anything but smooth. There were a lot of big egos involved, Eszterhas included. There was leading man Michael Douglas. There was the Dutch director Paul Verhoeven, who was coming right off of hits RoboCop and Total Recall. And then there was the original producer, Irwin Winkler, who was behind dozens of hit films in his long career, including Rocky and Goodfellas. Considering how successful it is, it's interesting that you actually were not a welcome visitor on the set. You were pretty much, weren't you kind of at war with the production?
With Basic?
Yes.
Yeah, we had a gigantic fight. Once again, on the ending of the movie, Michael, the first meeting that we had about the movie was at Winkler's house. And it was Michael and Paul and I and Irwin. And Paul didn't seem to me to have read it or understood it, because he had some ideas, and I don't remember what they weren't climactic, but I thought they were silly ideas. But Michael's idea, he was adamant, was that there's no redemption in the movie, and that she wins. Sharon wins at every time there's an issue. She wins. She's the victor, and there's no redemption. And we wound up having a yelling argument at Winkler's little den. And Paul leaned over the table and said, "Well, I am the director, and you are the screenwriter, yeah? You do what I tell you to do." And I said, "Oh, fuck you." And Michael got into it and said, "Well, you can't talk like that, blah, blah, blah. You can't talk like that. And I think that's really rude." And Winkler jumped to my side and said, "What do you know? You're an actor, right?" They left. Michael and Paul left. And as they're walking away, Winkler is so upset that he yells at Paul really loud, "You're a fucking Nazi, get the fuck out of here."
Fucking Nazi, get the fuck out of here?
Paul isn't a Nazi, Paul. He was Dutch. He was in Holland when the Nazis bombed Holland. He lost people in the bombings, all of that. So that was the first meeting. So after that, Winkler and I announced, well, first of all, the sale of Basic was across the top of the page in Variety, which is what everyone read at that time, across that big
3 million. It was record-breaking, correct?
Yeah. A new era begins in Hollywood. After this meeting, Irwin and I withdrew from the project. Another big banner headline, Eszterhas, Winkler withdraw from Basic.
So you've written the script. They've bought it. Can you withdraw and they can make your movie?
Yeah. They can make it without me.
Isn't that usually how things work, though? They pay for a screenplay, they take the screenplay, they do whatever the hell they want with it, they hire people to rewrite it.
Yes.
Why is your involvement? I mean, obviously, Winkler's involvement as a producer is important, but why is yours?
Because I'd had Flashdance and Jagged Edge, they were big both hits. And because the publicity for Basic was so overwhelming, not just in Variety. CBS had it on their evening news, and fucking Terry Drinkwater flew into a resort in Florida where I was vacationing for a few days. Landed on the sand and did this interview. It was a huge national publicity. So to pull out after that kind of publicity was a real story. After that kind of thing, to pull out of the project was a big story. That too went across the top of the page. So Paul brought in a screenwriter that he'd worked with, I think, on Total Recall, named Gary Goldman, I think. And they sat down for months rewriting my script. So months and months go by. And Andy Vajna, who was my Hungarian friend and who was one of the big bidders for Basic, calls me one day and he says, "Listen, Paul asked me to call you." I said, "What's up?" And he says, "Well, he wants to call you because he's decided that you're right. He's going to go back to the original first draft, make no changes, and he wants to talk to you about it." And I said, "Sure, fine." Paul calls, he says that, and more than that, he says, "I would like to hold a press conference with you, together with you, to tell the media that this is what I'm going to do." And I said, "Well, it's a really generous thing for a director to do. That doesn't happen, when directors say, 'No, I was wrong, and I'm going to tell the world about it.'" So I went down there and we held a press conference, and he sure did. He said he didn't understand the foundation and the basement of the script, as he called it, and that he was going to shoot the first draft. So we were fine again. So during the shoot, the gay community in San Francisco goes bonkers and says that this is a homophobic movie and it shouldn't be shot there. And one of the people leading the criticism is a gay councilman named Harvey Britt. Now, I've lived there, for many years, and Harvey's my friend. And Harvey calls and says, "Listen, all we want to do is to have a discussion. Can we get in a room? There are a bunch of people want to talk to." And I say, "Well, I'm fine with getting in a room." And I said, "Call Paul," And so he calls Paul, and Paul calls me and starts cussing me out and saying, "You betrayed us, you scumbag, you afraid of the..." He said I was afraid of the gay troopers who live in my area, that they were going to cause me violence. And I said, "Well, I'm not fucking no gay troopers to begin with, and no one's going to cause me violence." So he finally agrees. There's too much media pressure up there. And he finally agrees to sit in a room with a delegation of people. Michael is not there, but Paul's there. And the movie hires two gay PR people from San Francisco in an effort to work with the gay community. They're all there. And it's a long table. A lot of people, Paul and the two gay PR people, and Alan Marshall, the new producer, who in a Bill Cosby book was called a racist asshole, but these are new producers.
Oh, great.
They're all sitting at the end of the table, and I walk into this room. I said, I'm not going to sit there. So I sit down with Harvey Britt, who's my old friend, and we sit down on that side of the table. That immediately sets the two sides as Paul's looking at me like I'm Goebbels or someone, So we start talking, and I explain that Catherine Trammell is bisexual, which in my mind doesn't make her gay. It makes her both straight and gay. And I describe her as omnisexual in terms of her manipulative ability. They reject that and say that if you're bisexual, that immediately means you're gay. And Paul isn't saying much except he's sort of smirking every time they say something, to the point where Harvey Britt finally says, well, leans over saying, what the fuck is wrong with him? The upshot, they have a couple things that I agree to. One, the word dyke, the cop, George Zunza, the pal.
George Zunza, yeah, he was great in it.
He's great, I agree. He's great in it. To show how little I know about casting, I wanted to put Willie Nelson in that part.
I read that you wanted to put Willie Nelson in that part. I was trying to think about it. I can't even picture it.
No, total
wearing
idiot,
a serape or something out there.
Total idiot with casting. But Zunza has a couple lines where he refers to dykes in a pejorative way. And I say, fine, we don't have to use that word. Paul takes umbrage to that and says, I will not be critiqued, and this is criticism and censorship, and I will not be censored. So we leave the room, huffing and puffing at each other, Paul and I and everyone on that side. Big news in San Francisco. Front page on the Chronicle, the 11 o'clock news that night leads with it. Very funny, incidentally, because my daughter that day, my grown daughter Susie, had been in an animal rights protest, and the lead story was Basic Instinct, and they quote me and all of that stuff, and the animal rights protest, they show Susie being incarcerated, as the family news for the evening.
It is a very sexy movie. I mean, it seems like the lesbianism is played as kind of something to turn guys on, that this might not be like a true depiction of like actual lesbian relationships. And this is the kind of like lesbian relationships that it's kind of performative, like women kissing each other to turn guys on. I never imagined it that way. I never thought about it that way.
I wanted her to be omnisexual in terms of her manipulative abilities. And the thing with Roxy, I thought, was that. And then I wanted to have a woman who cut across all the sexual boundaries the same way that she was able to cut across anything on a lie detector test. There were no boundaries at all to her. So from that point on, we had no communication after that big blow up.
They saw you as sort of caving to the gay rights group.
Yeah, Paul is actually quoted as saying that I gave up because I was physically afraid of what gay stormtroopers would do to me since I lived in that area.
Gay stormtroopers?
Yeah, fucking insane. Queer Nation was protesting. If you know any of those guys, they're little guys in T-shirts. They're not stormtroopers. Anyway, we had nothing to do with each other. Movie came out. They never invited me to any screenings, rough cuts, anything, right? It was after that meeting. So I saw it for the first time at my local theater in Marin County with my son Steve, who was then 16, I think, 17. And there was such publicity attendant to this that there was a whole gaggle of camera crews waiting outside the theater for my reaction to the movie. So I came out, and I liked the movie. I liked it very much, and I said that, and then I complimented Verhoeven for it. And as Steve and I were walking away, Steve says to me, Pops, that scene with that interrogation scene, and geez, that's some scene. Where did you come up with the idea for that, Pops? And I thought, well, I'm either going to lie here or got to tell him the truth. It wasn't my idea. It was Verhoeven's. Because in my previous scene, the one in Stinson Beach, we saw that she was naked underneath the dress.
Right.
But to use it in the interrogation scene instead, it was Paul's, and it was brilliant. But what happened is that the movie became the biggest box office movie of the year worldwide. It made something like $800 million around the world. And Perry Match actually said Basic was not only the biggest movie of the year, but the biggest event of the year worldwide.
It was.
That's what led us to have a total disaster on Showgirls, because
I want to talk about
we
that,
thought we could do everything after that.
Right? But what's funny is I think that you write that Verhoeven, when he was casting Showgirls, he didn't want to consider Sharon Stone for the part of the older stripper that ultimately was played by Gina Gershon, because he was unable to sleep with her on the set of Basic Instinct.
They had an issue. The issue is stretched back to Total Recall. Sharon wouldn't sleep with him unless he left his wife.
Obviously you got to know Sharon Stone very well. She said that you created her. Is that how she would put it?
I said that.
Yes.
Yeah.
What does that mean?
First of all, it's facetious. It's tongue-in-cheek to start with. But secondly, I made her a star. In a sense, I created this persona, Sharon's persona, because she wasn't a star before then. That movie put her into some kind of stratosphere. And had it not come out of my twisted little man and twisted little brain, then that wouldn't have happened. But I did say it tongue-in-cheek.
When she was cast, did you think that she was right for the part? Had you heard of her?
Yeah, yes, I had heard of her. I'd seen her in Total Recall. I knew that they wanted to get going and that they had trouble casting the part. When I met her, I knew she was absolutely right for the part because she combined a real killer-like coldness with almost a cuddly kind of warmth in her persona. Paul, publicly has said that Sharon was Catherine Trammell. I don't think that's fair to her because the killer-like coldness is only one side, and the other side is a terrific warmth there, which on a personal level, I experienced and appreciated.
Do you use drugs, Miss Trammell?
Sometimes.
You ever use drugs with Mr. Boz?
Sure.
What kind of drugs?
Cocaine? Have you ever fucked on cocaine, Nick?
When you see Basic Instinct, it seems to me like it's a cocaine movie. I don't know whether you're doing coke at the time.
No, I knew all about coke, of course, but I didn't do any, and then I had a serious experience with coke. But that was in, my coke years were 71 to about 77. No.
You were on the cutting edge. I'm surprised you weren't doing a lot of coke in the 80s.
See, Rolling Stone was way ahead of Hollywood with coke. But by the time I got to Hollywood, it was a big deal. And I remember a very famous director, at a party and down on his hands and knees trying to sort the shit up of white shag rug where he dropped it, right? And literally, it was old news. And I stopped coke then.
Why did you stop?
I had, in my last, year at Rolling Stone, really bad experience with it. I was with a woman in a motel on Van Ness Avenue in San Francisco. We got in around 4 or 5 o'clock at night. I was there with her until 8 o'clock the next morning. But about at 7 o'clock at night, we were both doing a lot of coke and booze at the same time. I couldn't speak. I could form my thoughts, but I couldn't speak. I couldn't get them out. And then at 7 in the morning, my ability to speak came back. And my doctor said you had what's called a TIA, transient ischemic attack, which is a tiny stroke.
Oh my goodness, really?
And he said you have to stop the coke and then cut down on the drinking because that's what caused it. So that cured me.
Now, have you seen the first episode of Black Mirror?
No.
Have you ever heard of Black Mirror?
No, what is it?
It's sort of a British update on Twilight Zone. And the first episode is about the British Prime Minister who there's a crisis. And I can't remember whether it's whether people have taken a number of people hostage, but the only way he can get out of the crisis is by fucking a pig live on TV. Now, this sounded to me like...
Yes, exactly.
Now, tell me about your movie.
Well, the long history. Steven Spielberg got hold of the script through Guy.
What's the script called again?
Sacred Cows.
Sacred Cows.
Yeah, and Steven just loved it. And he and I had almost worked together on a remake of a guy named Joe and knew each other and said, I got to do this. I love this.
Well, tell me the plot before you tell me about the history of the project.
An incumbent president is running for re-election named Sam Parr, who was originally from Nebraska. He's a farm boy. He's a liberal Democrat. He's a lot of issues in his personal life. His daughter is getting a divorce that he's very close to. He's having arguments with his wife. The elections are going badly. He's drinking too much. And part of the campaign is to go back to Nebraska where he grew up. And he decides to stay in the same farmhouse where he grew up as a boy. So he does. And he gets rip-roaring drunk, wanders around, sleeps it off in the barn. And there in the barn is a cow just like the cow that he used to pop when he was a little boy. Okay, so he pops this cow. And the nasty right-wingers somehow sneak a photographer in and take a picture of him humping the cow, right?
An incumbent president has sex with a cow?
Yes.
Okay, great. All right.
Then it spins, into what happens after that and the campaign and all of that. But it was a kind of if I had to critique it, I would say it was a droll and dark, but in the end, Capra-esque kind of comedy, kind of semi-comedy, dark comedy.
Capra-esque?
Capra-esque, yeah. Capra-esque through Eszterhas's eyes.
Yeah, I was like, I can't imagine Frank Capra making a picture about fucking cows. But all right, go ahead.
Totally.
All right.
So Stephen gets it, loves it, and says, I got to do this. Even has ideas about having the Marine Corps band do the music, and starts really getting into it. And then he calls me one day and he says, I need some support on this thing. I sent it to Stanley Kubrick for him to produce it. He can produce it and I can direct it, and his name will bring a lot to it. And I said, great, whatever you think. Calls me in another couple of weeks and he said, I got this note from Stanley. Let me read it to you. And it says something like, Dearest Stephen, this could be the funniest thing I've ever read, but I don't want to get within 1,000 miles of it. No, thank you. So then it goes, and Stephen ultimately, eventually, not after such a long time, says, I can't do this. I've changed my mind. I'm sorry.
At what point in time was this for Steven Spielberg? His career could have gone a totally different direction if he had done a movie about a president fucking a cow.
I would say 80s, late 80s, 87, 88, somewhere in there.
So he was either going to do Schindler's List or a movie about a president fucking a cow.
And I don't remember what he did instead. but for a while he was really tempted. And then a whole bunch of other people were interested in it, wanted to do it actually. Laddie at the time was the head of MGM, and it was up to him to greenlight the thing. Alan Ladd Jr. So various people wanted to do it. Blake Edwards wanted to do it. And I had a meeting with Blake, and Blake's idea was he didn't really fuck the cow, but he dreamt that he fucked the cow, and he was afraid of actually having a president do that. Other people, Edward James Olmos, who at the time was directing. There were a whole raft of people, I forgot them, like David Anspaugh was a director who was hot because of Hoosiers,
So this was considered like one of those great unproduced screenplays going around Hollywood?
The Writers Guild magazine once did a piece and said it was the most well-known unproduced screenplay. I didn't know about Black Mirror until now, but it certainly was
I wonder if they were influenced by...
It's a lot of people read that script, so who knows?
Is this a thing? Because it was interesting. So I was watching, in anticipation, I interviewed Peter Bogdanovich not long ago, and I watched The Last Picture Show, and there's a scene where they're talking about fucking cows. How did you get were you influenced? Did you know of people who had done this? Did you do this?
I didn't do it, thankfully. Jesus. Thank God I didn't. And
Why?
Why?
Seems like everybody was doing it.
I don't think it would be good. In the Midwest, in farm country, boys, adolescents, popping cows is not unusual in real farm country. And as a matter of fact, on Betrayed, we did research. Tom and I and Costa did research in the Midwest in Nebraska, where some of these crazed right-wing rallies had been held. We went into that area to do a recce.
Tom Berenger, the actor.
Yeah. And part of what the Nebraska people lined up for us was lunches and interviews with farmers in the area. I remember a farmer at this one farmhouse. We had a guide with us from the state of Nebraska, and at this one farmhouse, Berenger was asked into the back room by 3 teenage girls so that he could interview their bras, So Tom disappears and
interview their bras?
That interview, autographed their bras. Meanwhile, Costa and I are sitting there, and this farmer says, listen, can I ask you guys something? Did you guys ever fuck a cow? And Costa goes, what did he say, Joe? He goes, well, there ain't nothing like fucking a cow,
Really?
So it's common there. He said it almost halfway like a joke because it's with adolescent kids.
Interesting. Because I would think that, this is sort of crass to say it, but I think if I were going to have sex with an animal, I might pick something smaller. Doesn't it seem like you'd kind of get lost in the cow? Yeah. Cow's very large.
You know what Brando was known for, right? The famous Brando thing? Taking a cat, sticking it into a boot by its head, and then fucking the cat in the boot.
Is this well known?
Yeah, I don't know if it's well known, but somebody swore to me that it was true.
Really?
Yeah. Now, the other thing that Brando did that I know is true is we were thinking of Brando for Music Box. Costa sent him the script, and Brando, who was staying on that island that he owns in the Pacific, said he was interested in talking about it. So Costa flew out there, and Costa told the story that, after he'd been there, Brando asked Costa to step into a little room, and on the room were hundreds of bottles lined up on shelves, names on them. And Brando asked Costa to shit into the bottle because this was Brando's collection of shit from famous movie people.
He really was an eccentric, wasn't he? This guy continues to surprise.
So Costa came back and said, no, we cannot work with him,
But of course he shit in the bottle for him, right?
Not good. He swore he didn't. I asked him.
He swore he didn't? He was like, it was one thing to I don't want to work in him, but of course I shit in the bottle.
No.
In 2018, at the very height of the Me Too reckoning, CBS News' Lee Cowan interviewed Sharon Stone. Cowan asked her if she'd ever been put in a situation where she was made to feel uncomfortable sexually during her career. And this was her response.
You're laughing, but I don't know. I don't know if that's a nervous laugh or are you kidding me? Of course I was. Laugh.
I've been in this business for 40 years, Lee. Can you imagine the business I stepped into 40 years ago?
You know, in reading everything that you've written about Hollywood, it just seems like it was a system that really was awful for women. I mean, can we look at there being an upside for them? I mean, just in terms of the casting couch, it seems like, you know, we have Paul Verhoeven who, you know, refused to think about her for Showgirls because she wouldn't sleep with him. And it's just so transactional and kind of terrible.
Right. It is.
Is it something that persisted throughout your time in Hollywood?
Yeah, on a studio level, on an executive level. In the time that I worked there, and I was physically going to meetings and discussions and all that stuff, which is over a 25-year period. The piece of meat syndrome was common, you know, in terms of actresses. If you sit around in a casting session, you know, the 35 was considered the death age. If you could get an actress under 35, they would be happy to do that. Several reasons. One, in terms of the way they thought an actress looked on the screen. Two, it was cheaper always to hire younger actresses who were starting out instead of ones who had a track record and who were working.
It seems like, you know, what's interesting reading your book is the way I feel like many movies were cast was probably the way that Jennifer Beals was cast in Flashdance. Michael Eisner had something to do with that, right?
I've never seen any other movie cast that way. Michael gathered together all the grips, the Teamsters, the Gappers, the blue-collar guys on Paramount Lot. And I gathered that he had never done this before in any movie. And he said, I'm going to show you guys 3 auditions for this movie called Flashdance, and I want to know one thing from you. I'm going to have you vote. Which of these 3 do you want to fuck? And it was Jenny Beals and Leslie Wing, a model, and Demi Moore, right? And Jenny won it. And they cast her. But I never heard of that after that, or, you know, and I gathered Michael had never done it either. And in terms of the corruption of it, I mean, you know, I worked with an actor who had a sex scene in one of my films, and he didn't have to do it himself because it was shot in a way where double could have easily done it. And the actor insisted on doing this simply because he got off doing it. The kind of corruption was everywhere.
You wrote that some producers actually around town would occasionally show outtakes from scenes between Billy Baldwin and Sharon Stone from Sliver, right?
Yeah, there was a whole sort of black market for outtakes of those scenes.
Were these sex scenes, were they actually consummated on film?
Well, it all depends on the individual case. Somewhere.
The famous case, I think, is Don't Look Now?
Yeah, Don't Look Now.
Julie Christie and Donald Sutherland, right?
Right.
They supposedly had sex in their famous scene, but there are a lot more where there was actual.
In my experience, in some cases, yeah.
And so this was something you could buy, and you said that producers would show it at like parties and stuff?
On occasion, yeah.
Like all guy parties or I mean like stag?
Mostly, certainly all guy parties.
What else? What else kind of shit like that? I'm curious.
Yeah, listen, I saw a lot of stuff. I saw the producer, I won't name him, he's dead. He called me Joe Bananas for the New York Gangster, right? And then he said, Bananas, you know, I get a blowjob every Thursday afternoon at 4 o'clock, you know, and if you want a beer at 4:30, you know, I can take care of that for you, right? And I said, no, thank you, but no. Then he said something interesting. He said, you know, I don't even have to pay her. I just pay her agency.
Pays the agency?
Pay the agency. No, I don't know.
Doesn't have to pay her directly. I know the producer on Fatal Attraction, Marty Ransohoff, called you Bananas, right?
Among other producers, he called me Bananas.
Marty had some issues with Glenn Close, right?
Yeah.
They were similar. What did he say about her?
There was a confrontation on the set, but there was something.
He was obsessed with her ass, wasn't he?
Yeah, he was. And then there was an ironic thing toward the tail end of it. He said that in the dailies, her ass looked too big. And then he was on the set one day during filming with his daughter, and he loved her, and they were very close. It was obvious that they were close. Glenn was filming, and she saw him, and she stopped the shot, and she said, I can't work with him in my eye line. Get him the fuck out of here. And they did, and he was mortified, and his daughter was mortified, and it was a really cruel thing to do.
Well, the things that you quoted him saying in your book, if she'd gotten any wind of it.
Right.
He'd said some pretty nasty things
about it. He did. But his daughter was there. And she shouldn't have done that with the daughter. There were other ways of doing it. So then what happened after that is Marty said there was a scene that hadn't been shot, and it was a bed scene with Jeff and with Glenn. And he said, I'm the producer, and when they shoot that scene, I'm going to stand there and I'm going to eye fuck her brains out, right? So then ironically, when Richard died, terrible Hollywood moments that I've experienced.
Richard Marquand.
Yeah, Richard died.
Who was the director?
The director.
Yeah.
Died unexpectedly young. And it fell to me to call people and let them know that Richard was dead. So I called Glenn. And I told her that he had died tragically. He was 47 years old and all that. And there was this pause. And Glenn said, well, I really never felt much for him. He made my ass look really big in that movie.
Now, in that moment, did you laugh or did you think this is the most inappropriate thing I've ever heard in my life?
I just hung up on it.
You hung up on it?
Right up on it.
There was a moment that I read in your book, and it gave me a feeling like I was in the presence of evil when you're sitting with Bob Evans, and you're sitting with two, prostitutes, one older and one younger. And I think he says at the end of the meeting, do you want to do the mother or the daughter?
Yes, I remember.
And I thought to myself, that might be the definition of evil. Somebody who is so diabolical that he hires the mother and daughter team of prostitutes.
Mind you that Bob Evans was one of the most charming and funny men that I met. And there was a lot of goodness to Bob as well. But let me phrase this delicately. He did have a real kinky side that came out sometimes. And I saw that kind of display on that kind of level, on a personal sexual level, quite a bit. Certainly in a sexual kind of sense, which is why the whole Me Too thing relative to Hollywood is really a wonderful development, because there was a lot of corruption on that level.
Now, Bob was not allowed on the set, which disturbed him greatly, on the set of Sliver, right?
Yeah. Sharon said that Bob had kept one of her friends in a dog collar at the house, and that she could never forgive him for that. So she had him banned from the set.
Did you believe her? I mean, I think that what you wrote in your book, that it was like, it sounded horrible that she was kept, it sounded almost like in a closet, naked in a dog collar for weeks at a time.
It was seriously twisted and ugly stuff. In my experience with Sharon, she wasn't a liar.
That's pretty awful.
Yeah, it's horrible. Absolutely horrible.
Do you feel like there's going to be some sort of reckoning? Is it the fact that Bob Evans isn't really working? The fact that he hasn't been drummed out of Hollywood for Me Too crimes?
Oh, he's very old.
No, I realize that, but
old. But I'm certainly not going to say that he committed sex crimes, because I don't know. But there's probably grounds for some investigation there in terms of the way he generally may have treated women.
What was surprising to me is you said he wasn't actually, like, you didn't think he was having sex with these women.
Not past a certain point. I remember I was at the Palm with Bob, and really pretty women passed behind us. And I said something like, boy, those are really gorgeous women, aren't they? And my boy, I haven't gotten it up since 1976, so what would I know? You may have been kidding. He got us a big laugh.
You said once that you felt like one of the reasons you were so polarizing was that you were a screenwriter who was, quote, scoring A-list pussy, unquote, and it drove people absolutely nuts.
The one thing that I can say categorically is that never, ever in any situation did I force myself, hurt anyone, assault anyone, rape anyone, harass anyone. The instant, and I'm lucky this way, I think, the instant that I felt that there was any kind of resistance, I would physically and mentally shrink, and I'd have no interest in it. Now, that doesn't say that I didn't score a lot of A-list pussy.
You were married throughout most of your time in Hollywood, correct?
In my first marriage, I was married until 94.
You met your wife, Jerry. She was a newspaper reporter, right?
Yeah, in 67.
You were married in 67?
Yeah.
And you were married for a long time, but if you read your memoir, there are many stories in it that don't suggest that you're married. I mean, it seems like you had a good time in Hollywood.
I certainly wasn't faithful to Jerry, and I blame myself for that. I regret that I wasn't, but I wasn't.
Pairing Joe Eszterhas with director Paul Verhoeven on a project seemed like such a winning combination that they couldn't lose. I mean, who could resist something brought to you by the team that created Basic Instinct? Well, a lot of people could actually resist it, as 1995 Showgirls proved. I'm going to play this one scene in which we hear Vegas producer Tony Moss casting his new show from a group of hopefuls.
Jesus Christ, Marty, take a look at these tits. What are these, watermelons? This is a stage, babe. It's not a patch. See ya. I've seen you before.
Yes, Mr. Moss, I auditioned for you in January. You told me to get my nose fixed.
Nose looks good.
Thank you, Mr. Moss.
Nice smile, too.
Thank you, Mr. Moss.
You know what, though? Your ears are sticking out. They are. Come back and see me when you get them fixed. See ya. Can you spell MGM backwards? I bet you can't.
MGM.
I'm impressed. Come back when you fuck some of this baby fat off. See ya.
You know, you talked about a little bit about, you know, the kind of meat mentality of Hollywood. And this was definitely like the meat mentality of
Vegas. We did a terrific amount of research before I wrote the piece. And then Paul and we hired a researcher who at the time worked for a Vegas paper named Lynn Waddell. And she set up all these interviews. And we must have done between 50 and 100 interviews with girls, with the showgirls of all kinds who worked at the classier clubs and some of the sleazier clubs.
Was it a party? I mean, the audition process sounds like it could have been fun.
The scene was based on how a well-known Vegas casting person picked girls. Some of the dialogue from it, much of the dialogue from it came from what the girls said, were things that had been said to them.
I mean, it's brilliant. I imagine, you know, feminist groups probably went crazy over it and said that, you know, there's objectification.
But what I would say to that is I'm sure they did, but that's the way it was.
Yeah.
You know, I don't think that capturing factual reality about things are, and necessarily at all, if it's based on research, reflects the writer's opinion of purposely doing it. I mean, I think we researched the hell out of that piece. First time I met Elizabeth Berkley, and Naomi and I were there, and it was the first time that we'd been on a set together. And Paul said, "When are you coming down to the set?" He was shooting on the set in L.A. And I said, well, what if we come down day after tomorrow? And great, we're shooting some good stuff. It's great. And I said, I'm going to bring Naomi. Is that cool? And he said, absolutely. So she wears a very pretty dress, and she looks really, really very pretty and very classy. You know, and I'm wearing my usual horseshit shorts and a t-shirt and flip-flops. And so as we're heading into the scene, we're walking by a bunch of gaffers and people and Teamster types. And I hear this one guy say, hey, check that out. Who's the fucking prom queen? And I look, Naomi looks at us, looking at me. We get in, and it's a dancing scene. And both Berkley and Gina are stark naked, you know, and there's this sweat dripping every place. And my wife had never been in that kind of environment, you know. And then Paul sees Naomi's reaction, and he's having fun. He's saying, nice, nice, mate. We having fun. We don't know me. We have great fun. Know me, meet know me, right? Because like a total idiot, I named the main character after my wife, you know, and her nickname was Know Me. So we spend some time, and we watch the scene. We walk out, and Naomi said, well, what do you think of Berkley? She's the lead of the movie. I wasn't pleased with her choice. My reaction was, I shouldn't get in trouble for saying, but my reaction was I looked at my wife and I said, Jesus Christ, they cast a Japanese fuck doll instead of Nomi Malone. And so...
And Elizabeth Berkley has gone, you know, she's done talk shows where she's ruined her career and all this stuff. But how did she get cast? Because she was not the only actress up for this. There were other big actors that wanted this role, correct?
I'm not sure who wanted it. One of the conceptions was Madonna and Drew Barrymore.
Drew Barrymore is the younger stripper.
The youngest stripper.
Madonna was really interested, right, in playing the Gina Gershon character?
Madonna was interested, but she had all kinds of script notes and different creative ideas. And Paul said in his mind it wasn't worth redoing those.
Well, I think she probably, if she'd read the script and if the script probably wasn't a good idea for her to do that role.
Right. Drew Barrymore, I gather, what Paul somehow determined that she just couldn't dance, and that would make it very difficult.
But you were hot. You were so hot right now that I think being in this movie with you teamed with Verhoeven again could have done for somebody's career what it had done for Sharon Stone's career, correct?
Yeah, it could have. And then interestingly, I just written and sold a spec called Foreplay, thriller, and it was all over the trades. And when I spoke to Elizabeth was living with Paul at the time during the shooting.
Well, why don't we go back? We've gotten ahead of ourselves. So how did she get cast? Charlie Evans, who was Bob Evans' brother.
Yes.
Who had he supported his brother for years, right? Charlie actually had a lot of money.
Charlie and Bob were partnered together in the dress clothing business in New York.
Yeah.
And Charlie, I don't know this for a fact, but the rumor certainly was that Charlie had helped Bob financially and during his times of crisis. While we were talking about Jade, Bob introduced me to Charlie and said Charlie really wanted to get into some kind of top flight movie project.
Presumably he'd seen his brother Bob's lifestyle. I met Charlie once, and he was with a girl who was, it certainly wasn't half his age. She was probably a quarter of his age.
Right.
He liked younger girls.
Yes.
I wrote about him once, and I said he had a baked potato tan. He looked like
ran in the Evans family, that tan.
Yeah. Anyway, so Charlie wanted to get into the business.
Yeah, Charlie wants to get into business, and Bob knew about Showgirls, and he said to Charlie, "Would you mind talking to Charlie about?" And I said, "Well, how would that work? If I did this, I wanted to do it. I'd want to do it as a spec, instead of how would that work with Charlie coming in as a producer?" And he said, "Well, I'll get you together with Charlie," and he did. And Charlie was just gung ho. Without even knowing a whole lot about what it was. Just a combination of me doing a script and maybe Paul. Paul at that point hadn't committed to it, but certainly I was going to try to go in Paul's direction. Anyway, got together with Charlie. He was desperate to get into it. What wound up happening is that Charlie wound up putting up $2 million up front.
For your script? Didn't he give you
the script? And the day after we cashed the check, he had to go to the hospital because he had a near heart attack. And what happened to it financially after that, of course, was that Mario came into it, I think. Charlie, as the producer, calls Paul one day, and this is during prep and casting, and said that he just auditioned. Charlie, had auditioned a young actress who would be sensational in the movie. And Paul said, something like, "You auditioned someone, where did you?" And so I auditioned her in my hotel room. And Paul said, "You fucking crazy, man. You can't audition people. Who are you to auditioning them?" "Well, I'm the producer." Anyway, he said, "Forget about it. I'm not interested in whomever you auditioned, okay? And don't do it again."
Did you get the feeling that this was what Charlie's motivation for getting into the business was, getting some of what his brother had?
Charlie told us up front when he was wanting to be the producer that all he wanted was a big trailer and the chance to meet a lot of the actresses who were going to be in the movie. Okay, that was pretty clear. So Paul says, "Go away, don't audition anybody. I'm not interested in your choices." And then somehow, I don't know how, Paul winds up auditioning the same actress, Elizabeth Berkley, and picks her for the part. Now it turned into a romance because Paul actually publicly left Martine's wife. They were separated from Martine living with Elizabeth in a hotel during all the shooting in the movie.
So we think about this story in two ways. We either think, what a horrible system that would make Elizabeth Berkley have to sleep with not only the producer but the director to get this part. Or we think, wow, what an ambitious girl. She obviously fixated on something that she wanted, and she knew how to get it, and she got it. Is this a tragedy? Is it a comedy?
The answer to that is ambiguous. Both. You could have absolutely both. I don't know. I don't know what the motivation was. You'd have to be Elizabeth Berkley to really answer that question.
What did you think at the time when you met her?
I thought it was a mistake to cast her.
And it was folly for both the producer and the director, correct? I mean, she could not carry... I mean, God bless her, but she was unable to carry this movie, correct?
Correct. And one of the reasons that I saw the movie again, I guess I hadn't seen it for a long time, and then I saw it in New York. There was a Showgirls screening, maybe an anniversary screening, and I looked at it again, and it's truly over the top.
It's camp. I mean, I think it's been sort of...
Yeah, but beginning with my script, incidentally, because I thought the script was completely over the top, too, looking at it. I laughed out loud in that final big kiss moment between the two women. It's so over the top that it's truly funny.
Remind me, it's been a while since I've seen... Which big kiss?
It's the moment between Crystal and Nomi. And it's like their friendship, and it's a big smoochy.
Is it a big lesbian kiss or just a...
It's a lesbian kiss,
okay.
Yeah. But it's so over the top that it's insane.
I'm sorry, Crystal.
Yeah, I know just how sorry you are. How do you think I got my first lead? There's always someone younger and hungrier coming down the stairs after you.
Why didn't you tell anyone?
Oh, hell, darling. I needed a rest. Besides, my lawyers got me a real nice settlement.
I gotta go.
Aren't you gonna come here and give me a big kiss?
And then the reason for that, one reason for that certainly is the hubris that both of us were guilty of, having come off a Basic Instinct, right? It's just over the top, and then in every way.
So you don't think, you wrote about it in your book as the biggest bomb since Ishtar or what's the Cimino movie? Heaven's Gate. Yeah, you wrote about it as basically the biggest bomb since either of these movies. Is there something that could have happened that could have made this movie not a bomb? Or did it start, was it a bomb as it emerged from your typewriter, as it emerged from your word processor?
Yeah, from my manual typewriter right the first time. I suspect that it was, and that it just got worse. And that instead of restraint, both Paul and I went completely over the top in terms of it. And then that goes from the hubris I was trying to describe to you. You know, if you have the biggest smash of the year, and everyone is bowing down and genuflecting to be able to do your next movie, whatever the hell you want to do, you know, then you can make mistakes. And I certainly think I made them, and I think he made them as well. Now, it became such a camp hit and such a cult hit that I'm told that it's one of the biggest selling DVDs of all time.
Now, being at the epicenter of Hollywood money and debauchery is not Eszterhas's only story. It's far from it. So check this out. In 1989, Music Box, it's a courtroom drama based on Eszterhas's screenplay, comes out. The movie stars Jessica Lange, and it features Armin Mueller-Stahl as her father, and he's a Hungarian immigrant accused by the U.S. Justice Department of slaughtering Jews during World War II, decades and decades ago.
I didn't do any of that. That's not me. I'm a citizen. I'm a good American.
If you're a good American, Mr. Laszlo, this country's in big trouble.
It's a crime he swears he absolutely didn't commit. It's a case of mistaken identity, and Lange, a lawyer, defends him against the charges. But then, in the movie's final twist, she's horrified to discover that her father is actually guilty of these crimes. You had done this movie, The Music Box, and this movie is produced, and your father likes the movie.
I sent my father my script before there was a movie, and he read the script, and it wasn't easy for him to read English, but he read it and translated it with the dictionaries and shit. And he said, I've never been prouder of you than I am at this moment.
Now, at this point, you don't know of your father's history. Did you? You must have suspected something.
Look, it's the great mystery, the psychological riddle at the heart of all of this.
So this is unreal. Just 1 year after the release of Music Box, Eszterhas's father, who's then 83, living in Cleveland, receives a letter from the Justice Department's Office of Special Investigations informing him that he is the subject of an inquiry involving possible war crimes. They accuse him of authoring anti-Semitic writings as a member of Hungary's Arrow Cross Party during the war. I feel like anti-Semitism comes up a lot in your films.
Well, you know my background. You know, you've read.
Well, let's talk about that. So you write this script and it's made. Jessica Lange represents her father, who's accused of war crimes, and he's Hungarian. And she subsequently finds out that he actually was a war criminal. You're Hungarian.
Right.
And you grew up where?
I grew up for the first 6 years in refugee camps in Austria, and then for the rest of it here in Cleveland on the west side.
How did you end up in refugee camps?
Let me tell you the story that my parents told me, and then let me tell you what I discovered when the whole hearings happened over my father. My father's account was that it was the end of the war, and we fled from a city in Hungary called Szombathely to a camp in Austria called Perg, and that we were there until the war ended, which was months after we had gone to Perg from Hungary. And from there, we went to British camps and American camps. When these hearings began, I saw all the evidence that the OSI had. One of the things that they pointed out was that the camp that we went to, Perg, was a Nazi camp tied to the Mauthausen extermination camp that in Perg used to give shelter to former Hungarian officials who had been either in the Arrow Cross or had been in favoring the Nazis. So obviously the truth that as I determined it after the hearings and after a whole lot of detective work in terms of the things I've been told as a child, was that they went there to be sheltered because of his role. This is a place where they could
be protected.
Yeah, because of his role as a press attaché attached to the Hungarian Prime Ministry. Because of that, he was a protected Nazi official. Even worse than that, I discovered in the hearings, was that in the period of time when my mother and father were separated from each other because she was very pregnant with me. The war looked like it was ending. The Russians were coming from one side to invade Hungary. My mom and I were in Szombathely, and he stayed in Budapest because he said he had to stay there because of his duties at the Prime Ministry. Well, what he really did, I discovered at the hearings, was burn documents before the country was taken over to get rid of the documents, right? I'd heard stories as a kid about how when he left us in one camp and went to another camp, because the communists were hunting and rape fervent anti-communists. So he had to hide from the communists who were coming in after the war.
So he said that it was his anti-communist.
They all hid under that anti-communist banner.
Really?
Yeah. I saw my dad. We lived in a duplex on Lorraine Avenue in the very small apartment. I slept on the couch in the living room of the apartment. My parents' bedroom was over here. He was the editor of this Catholic Hungarian newspaper. I saw him innumerable times having big arguments with crazed anti-Semites about the Jews. And I saw him argue and say, you have to stop this is wrong, blah, blah, blah.
Within the Hungarian Catholic community, was there a lot of, even in this country, a lot of anti-Semitism?
Yes, absolutely. I saw the anti-Semitism, and it wasn't solely Catholic, but it was totally Hungarian. It was what we call the Strudel ghetto on the west side of Hungarian immigrants. I saw him argue with the people who ran the newspaper, the priests, Franciscan priests, who were crazed anti-Semites, and the contributors to the paper saying that anti-Semitism is wrong, and they're wrong, and they should stop this and all of that. Now, at the same time...
You must have been proud of him.
Yeah, of course. At the same time as I grew up, he said to me, don't judge people by their color, their religion, judge them by their character and what they do. That was his big lesson. And he was a terrific inspiration to me. I saw him make speeches in the Hungarian community. They're all big speech makers, these Hungarians, talking about the war being over. I saw him specifically condemn anti-Semitism. Now I wonder, and when the hearings happened, I wonder if the whole thing was a fucking alibi. If he was so frightened of being nailed for the things that he did, that he decided to posit himself in this kind of direction.
So you sent your father the screenplay to this story, which essentially tells his story. Do you think that he had an inkling that you were onto him?
I've wondered that a lot, and I've thought about it. The greater question, my great old good friend named Jerry Messerman, who was the attorney in this case, Jerry absolutely feels that I had to have heard something, had an inkling as a kid or something, that I had to have seen something, because it's too coincidental that this is the story that I tell. It's such a horrible dichotomy in terms of I would not have been as successful as I was had it not been for his inspiration and urging and all of that. And to find all of this horror in 92.
And this was how many years after Music Box was produced?
Well, Music Box was it came out in either 89 or 90, and then this all blew up in 90.
Real?
Yeah.
How did you respond to him?
It destroyed our relationship forever. When he was dying, I didn't go to see him.
Are you comfortable with that? Do you regret that at all?
Yeah, I do now.
Did he apologize to you?
To the end, he maintained that he did nothing. He said if I did anything and it didn't make it better, he said I was a poor kid in Hungary, in Kispest, and everyone was against the Jews. And if I did anything wrong, it was because that was the only way to get ahead in Hungary at the time.
Careerism.
Yeah, but that didn't make it any better for me.
I don't ever want to see you again, Papa. I don't want Mikey to ever see you again.
You can't do this.
Dad, you don't exist.
It wasn't long after Eszterhas discovered his cancer that he also found Jesus. You got cancer.
I was really hoarse, but I'd been hoarse before with polyps. And I had diagnosed with the so-called surgeons to the stars in Beverly Hills. And they said it was nothing to worry about. They said it was on an outpatient level. We could deal with it. And it was probably another polyp this one near the throat. Now, about 5 or 6 months later, we decided to move to Cleveland. And an old friend of mine said, I don't like your voice, Joe. And she knows me a long time. And then I said, well, it's nothing. I went to the best people. And she said, well, do me a personal favor. I have a friend who's a really good throat guy. Go see him. It's just as a favor to me. So Naomi and I went, scoffing at the whole notion of it, and did an exam where they snake this thing through your nose, down through your throat. And he turned to us very grimly and he said, all I see is necrotic tissue. He said, you have between stage 3 and stage 4 throat cancer. And he said, you need immediate surgery. Now, I knew I brought it up on myself. I started smoking when I was 12 and drinking when I was 14 years old. I was a heavy drinker and a chain smoker. So the first thing we did after leaving his office is I went to a great bar and I got a couple of martinis and smoked some cigarettes. It was a very complicated surgery, and it had only been done once in Switzerland. The condition to it, he said, if we're lucky, this will work. And because they were afraid that muscles were going to tear out of my throat if they attach some muscles. And he said, the only way you have a chance at surviving is if you stop smoking and stop drinking immediately. So I survived the surgery, and I tried to stop smoking and drinking, and I just went nuts. My nerve endings were jangling. I walked twice a day for an hour here.
Did you go cold turkey on both?
Yeah. And I found that the walks relieved some of the cravings that I had. But on this particular day, it was a really hot, muggy day in Cleveland. I was sweating like a pig. And I started to cry walking because I felt so awful. I sat down on a curb crying. And suddenly, to my great surprise, I heard myself saying, please, God, help me. And it helped. And it led to further prayer. And then it led me to church. It was a reconversion because I'd grown up as a Catholic kid. And I was an altar boy and all of that. And I really turned against God. My mother had a horrible cancer at the age of 50. And she really suffered horribly. And she was a woman of great faith. And I just got very angry at God for a very long time until that moment.
So did you stop believing in Jesus?
I not only stopped believing in Jesus, but I was militantly opposed to Jesus and wrote all kinds of things that were ungodly, to say the least. Anyway, it led me to being involved in my church. It led me ultimately to become what I would now consider being a devout a la carte Catholic. So yes, it had a terrific effect on my life, and it has to this day. And I would say that besides my family and Naomi, Jesus Christ has become the bedrock of my life.
So Jesus led Joe Eszterhas to seek out a fellow sinner. This was an A-list actor who, at that particular moment, was best known for a series of shocking tapes that were leaked by his ex-girlfriend. And here's just a little taste if you've forgotten what they sound like.
You need medication.
I need a woman, not a fucking little girl with a fucking dysfunctional cunt. I need a fucking woman. I don't need medication. You need a fucking bat in the side of the head. All right? How about that?
But to Eszterhas, Mel Gibson wasn't just that beastly guy from those tapes. He was also the creator of 2004's The Passion of the Christ, and this was a film that Eszterhas totally adored, even if a lot of critics considered it anti-Semitic. Okay, so Mel Gibson, at a certain point, is having trouble. These Oksana tapes leak. That was around 2010 or 2011. A few years before he got picked up in Malibu after drinking too much tequila and said the Jews are responsible for all the wars of the world. And after all this, you decide that you're going to do a movie with him. It's interesting to me, considering how conscious you were of your father's anti-Semitism. I mean, basically, you signed up to write a movie with a guy who was pretty much an established anti-Semite.
Yeah, let's take this in steps. I was aware and I knew completely in detail the anti-Semitic charges that he was faced with in terms of the cop and everything else that he'd said. I didn't agree with the notion that The Passion of the Christ was an anti-Semitic picture. And I thought it was one of the most powerful movies that I'd seen and beautifully directed.
This was significant, right, in your conversion? The film?
It played a part. When Warner Brothers got involved let me tell you how now Mel and I are coming together. I'd written a piece about Our Lady of Guadalupe. That was a spec piece that later on Mark Burnett, Roman Downey optioned. We'd sent the script to Mel to direct. I don't know what you know about Our Lady of Guadalupe, but there was no possibility of anything anti-Semitic or virulent being chopped into in that piece, because the piece takes place in Mexico historically and all of that. It's a very religious Christian piece. One of his guys let my manager know that he really liked that Guadalupe piece.
Mel did.
Yeah. The next beat that happened was that Craig got a call from one of Mel's people saying that he'd like to talk to me about a project that he had in mind called the Maccabees. And I didn't know the Maccabee story very well, but I went to the Apocrypha of the Bible and read the story in terms of what it was about. And we met, and he said that the reason he wanted to do the Maccabees is because it's a story of Jewish independence and Jewish strength. And the way he was talking, I thought that he wanted to do it as a kind of apologia for the things he was being accused of. Brought Warner Brothers into it, and Warner Brothers thought the same thing, that this was going to be his response to all the accusations of the anti-Semitism. And Warner was excited about it. His relationship was with Warner's because he'd made them a lot of money. And those are the people that he wanted to work with again. And I think even in the big meeting that we had, one of the Warner's guys said to him, well, this is going to be your response to some of the things that are being said about you. And he said, absolutely.
But let me stop you for just a second, though. If somebody gets drunk and says that they hate Jews, and they've said it publicly, I mean, is it really significantly different than what your father did?
It is in the sense that my father, I learned, had burned documents, had done book burnings, the vileness of the propaganda that he wrote, that he had his name on, at a time when Jewish people were being put into concentration camps all over Europe, and Hitler had openly done his program of extermination. And my father wrote a book talking about the parasites who must be faced with the iron strength of the law. I think that's both contextually and also on the face of it. It's anti-Semitism, but it's a degree of virulence that may not be what I discovered to be the case later on with Mel. But
so you thought, I guess my question is, in his heart, it seems like there was anti-Semitism. Is it a bit cynical to say, okay, this is going to be my apologia, I'm going to make a movie?
I really trusted myself here when I got into business with him. If I sensed, and I did, that this was truly an anti-Semitic attempt, that as Mel later said, that what we're going to do is do a movie to convert the Jews, right? That I would let the world know. And I really did feel, so did Warner's, that he wanted to try to, quote, make up for all of this, right? And then the Maccabee story really is a terrific story of Jewish strength and independence and all that. So
you knew Hutton, his father, was was on record.
I hadn't met Hutton yet, but yes, I knew about him, and I knew what he's on record for.
He was on record basically saying that the Holocaust was either wildly overstated or it didn't even happen at all.
Didn't happen at all. It's Holocaust denier.
Oh, and also, you had written a memoir that apparently Mel hadn't read. You had decided that The Passion of the Christ was not an anti-Semitic picture. Right. However, you went back and you read the source material that he used for it. And you found the source material highly anti-Semitic. And then you said in your book, before working with him, quote, Mel shares the mindset of Adolf Hitler.
Yes.
Okay. This is the guy who you thought you could work with.
No, I thought that if he's going to tell the Maccabee story, and if I'm going to do it, I knew the kind of story that I would write. And he kept saying publicly that this was going to be his answer to all the anti-Semitic charges. And I thought, terrific. They could be really good if we do that.
How did you hear Mel refer to Jews?
Well, I heard him use words like Hebes and oven dodgers and Jew boys.
Oven dodgers is really, that's the one I think that actually kind of gets me the most.
It's awful. It's horrible.
And then he said something to your son. He said something violent to your son. I'll find the part.
It was about Oksana. That's that thing that...
It says, and this is part of the letter, shortly after we got there, you and my son Nick and some others went surfing. Naomi and I reluctantly allowed Nick to go with you. On the way to the sea, walking along the sand, you turned to Nick and said, I want to fuck her being Oksana, in the ass and stab her to death while I'm doing it. How old was Nick at the time?
15. It horrified me. I mean, I just... Look, my basic thing on Mel, in Heaven and Mel, I think the basic point of this is that man needs help. There's an illness at the core.
What do you think the illness is?
Cancer at the core. I'm not a psychologist, but there's something that's very twisted at the core. My great fear with Mel is that unless somebody really helps him, he can either cause himself or others real damage. He needs help that way.
He'd been on tape saying horrible, really hateful things to this woman. Hollywood did forgive him for all the things that he said. Should Hollywood have forgiven him?
I'm not certain that Hollywood has forgiven him. Some people in Hollywood seem to have forgiven him, but I don't think I wouldn't say that Hollywood has forgiven him.
So wasn't he nominated for an Oscar for directing for Hacksaw Ridge? He seemed like he's gotten the full embrace from Hollywood. So as a Christian yourself, is this guy worthy of forgiveness? Should he be working?
I think forgiveness depends on repentance, and then forgiveness just shouldn't be tossed about. And I don't know that I've seen anything that says to me that he's really repented for the things that he said or done.
Should you be able to work if you're an anti-Semite that just doesn't express your anti-Semitic views?
If I were the president of Hollywood, I wouldn't let him work, and I would think that he reflects horribly on Hollywood. But I'm not the president of Hollywood.
There are people who have been sort of drummed out of Hollywood for sexual trespasses. So it seems like some people get punished and some people don't.
Unless there is some indication that Mel doesn't feel the way that I saw him feel in the course of my experience. And I certainly haven't seen any sign that there's any indication of that. And I agree with you. I think he should be banned, and he shouldn't work.
Knowing what you know about him and having spent time with him, you can't kind of crack what happened to him to make him the way he is?
No, I don't know. I know that he has a very, very close relationship with his dad. And I know that 5 minutes after I met his dad outside of Mel's church in Malibu, his dad started telling me about how Pope John Paul I, who was only in office for like 30-some days, had been murdered by a cardinal who sat on him with his bare ass and suffocated him.
Was he smiling at the time, Hutton?
Oh, no, he's dead serious.
Really?
Very, very serious.
I guess the old expression is the apple doesn't fall far from the tree. Did Hutton seem to be beyond saying that a pope was killed by a bare ass? Did he seem nuts to you?
I don't want to say that he's nuts, but in my opinion, it wasn't the sanest thing to say 5 minutes after he met me.
You are now somewhat more modest about talking about things in person than you have been in your books. I didn't know whether that was because you're older or because you are more religious now. But there have been things in your books that, are jaw droppers. So this was from Hollywood Animal. I didn't know that I'd create my own Marilyn and I'd nail her, but that nailing her would pale in comparison to the havoc that her presence would wreak in my life. And then you mentioned, I figured that since I'd written the biggest hit of her life, she was just saying thank you. At the end of the night, which was only just a few hours, I felt underpaid. I knew most screenwriters would have felt overwhelmed. Patty Chayefsky never did get over Kim Novak, and I knew that Sharon thought that she was flattering me that night by treating me as if I were a director and not a screenwriter. But still, Basic Instinct had been a #1 box office hit of the year in the whole world. I felt I deserved her. I mean, do you feel in your life as a 75-year-old observant Catholic you'd change anything about that?
I think the only thing I'll say to address that is that even though I am a devout a la carte Catholic, I've been neither lobotomized nor castrated.
Okay. That's a pretty good answer. Well, Joe Eszterhas, thank you so much for the generous... How much fun have we had? Have you enjoyed this?
Fun. I've enjoyed it. It was terrific.
Thanks for listening. Please subscribe and rate and tell your friends all about what you learned today about Hollywood and Marlon Brando and those poor little kitty cats. The Originals is produced by me and Jessamine Molly. Special thanks to Naomi Eszterhas, a fantastic host who bakes amazing cookies. The Originals is a highly replaceable production.